A Death in Silence, July 17th, 1576. In the heart of Tuscany, nestled in the cypress-shadowed hills, the Villa Medici di Cafaggiolo rises like a fortress against the dawn. That morning, its great stone walls held a silence so unnatural that even the servants whispered in fear. In the grand bedchamber, draped with tapestries and silks imported from the East, a woman lay still. She was only 33 years old. Her name was Eleonora di Garcia di Toledo, Grand Duchess of Tuscany. Her death would shake not just Florence, but the courts of Renaissance Europe. Yet, what happened in that room was not simply a death. It was, if the stories are to be believed, a performance. A sentence carried out, not in the glare of the law, but behind locked doors, stitched together with cruelty and silence. The official record tells us she succumbed to a sudden fever. A familiar explanation in an age where illness often swept away the living without warning. But Florence was not fooled. Rumors spread faster than plague, and the whispers carried a darker tale, that Eleonora had not died naturally at all, that she had been murdered by her husband, Francesco de' Medici, in a fashion so grotesque that even the chroniclers hesitated to write it down. The tale claimed her mouth, her very lips, had been sewn shut while she was still alive, a punishment, symbolic and cruel, meant not just to kill, but to silence. It was more than rumor. It was a legend born from fear, gossip, and the cruel realities of power. Florence, after all, was a city where voices were often silenced by poison, by exile, by a dagger in the night. But the idea that a Grand Duchess, a woman of such stature, could be mutilated in this way struck a deeper chord. It was a symbol of the brutal fate awaiting women who strayed from obedience. And so the question lingers: how did one of the most powerful women in Renaissance Italy meet such an unthinkable end? Was she truly silenced with a needle and thread? Or was her death simply twisted by rumor into myth? To understand, we must travel back 16 years to a Florence glittering with art and wealth, but haunted by shadows just as dark. The year was 1560. Italy pulsed with the brilliance of the Renaissance. Florence was a jewel, its churches crowned with domes, its walls hung with frescoes that seemed to breathe. Everywhere, something magnificent was being born. Michelangelo still sculpted in Rome, Titian painted in Venice, and philosophers in Florence spoke of human dignity, reason, and beauty. To the outside eye, it was an age of light. But beneath the frescoed ceilings, another world thrived, one far less radiant. Princes ruled with unchecked power, their whims enforced by daggers in alleyways, and poison in golden cups. And among them, no family held greater sway in Florence than the Medici. They had risen from bankers to rulers, shaping not just Florence's politics, but its very identity. The Medici were patrons of artists, builders of palaces, financiers of popes, but theirs was also a dynasty haunted by suspicion, jealousy, and blood. They knew that power had to be defended at all costs, and mercy was rarely part of the calculation. At the center of this story stands Francesco de' Medici, firstborn son of Cosimo. To his father's court, he appeared the perfect Renaissance prince, educated, refined, heir to a glittering empire. Yet those who looked more closely saw another side, a restless jealousy, a cold suspicion of others, and an insatiable hunger for control. It was this man that fate bound to Eleonora di Garcia di Toledo, the daughter of the powerful Spanish viceroy of Naples. She was just 17 when she left her homeland, her youth wrapped in velvet, lace, and expectation. She had beauty that turned heads, dark olive eyes, flawless skin, and the grace of a noblewoman raised in Spain's most refined courts. Her marriage to Francesco was more than personal, it was political. sealing the alliance between Florence and the Spanish crown. Her journey from Naples to Florence had the air of a fairy tale. She rode in a carriage lined with silk, escorted by retinues of Spanish guards and Florentine nobles. People crowded the streets of Tuscany to see her arrival, whispering of the new duchess who carried Spain's honor and Medici ambition in her person. To the onlookers, her future glowed with promise. But beneath the pageantry, she was riding toward a gilded cage, for the story that began that year, in autumn of 1560, would not be one of romance. It would be one of control, possession, and a young woman's desperate search for freedom in a world designed to silence her. And so, before we reach the horror of that July night in 1576, we must first step back into the radiant, yet ruthless Florence of her youth, to trace the path that led Eleonora, not just to her death, but to the legend that followed. A marriage forged in power. The year was 1560, and Florence stood at the very height of its Renaissance brilliance. The city's skyline glowed with terracotta domes, and the sound of chisels against marble echoed from workshops where artisans struggled to surpass the legacy of Michelangelo. Scholars filled libraries with new ideas, merchants haggled over silks and spices, and noble families wove alliances that could shift the balance of power in Italy with a single marriage contract. It was in this atmosphere of beauty and ambition that the fate of Eleonora de Garcia de Toledo was sealed. Born into Spanish nobility, she carried both refinement and the heavy weight of political expectation. Her father, Garcia Alvarez de Toledo, the Viceroy of Naples, was one of Spain's most powerful men, a figure whose loyalty to the Spanish crown made him invaluable to King Philip II. His daughter, Eleonora, was not just a young woman. She was a bridge between dynasties, a pawn in the larger chessboard of Europe. The Medici needed Spain. Cosimo I, Duke of Florence, had clawed his family's way from merchants to monarchs, but legitimacy was still fragile. Old aristocracies whispered that the Medici were upstarts, bankers draped in velvet. A marriage alliance with Spain would silence those whispers and cement Florence's place among the great European powers. And so, Eleonora was chosen. For Francesco de' Medici, the groom-to-be, marriage was never about love. He was 19, the firstborn son of Cosimo, and heir to Florence's fortune and throne. He was a man schooled in diplomacy, science, and the humanist arts, raised in palaces filled with paintings, jewels, and alchemists' laboratories. On the surface, he seemed the very image of a Renaissance prince, cultured, educated, noble. Yet within, there stirred a temperament far less polished than envy that burned hot, suspicion of anyone who might betray him, and a hunger not simply to rule, but to possess. When Eleonora left Naples, she stepped into this glittering but treacherous world. Her journey northward was marked by spectacle. Courtiers described her arrival in Florence as if a queen had entered the city. Velvet canopies draped the streets, bells rang from every tower, and musicians filled the piazzas with music. Her carriage was gilded, lined with velvet cushions, and surrounded by attendants in Spanish, black, and Florentine crimson. The people craned their necks to see her, whispering of her beauty and elegance. And then came the wedding itself, held in the autumn of 1560 at the Palazzo Pitti. For a week, Florence became a theater of celebration. Nobles arrived from every corner of Italy, bringing jewels, silks, and gifts meant to honor the union. Banquets overflowed with roasted game, sugared fruits, and wine from the Tuscan hills. Masks and dances filled the halls, their costumed performers weaving allegories of love and dynastic strength. It was more than a wedding, it was a performance of power. One designed to remind Florence's rivals that the Medici were not just patrons of the arts, but masters of the stage of politics. At the center of it all stood Eleonora, dazzling in gowns of Spanish lace and Florentine silk, her dark eyes capturing every gaze. Chroniclers noted her grace, her composure, her ability to embody the virtues expected of a duchess. She was not only beautiful, she was symbolic, a woman whose very presence stitched together to dynasties. But for Francesco, she was something else. From the moment he laid eyes on her, he was captivated. It was not the tender devotion of love that filled him, but an obsession that cut far deeper. To him, she was not a partner, but a possession. He wanted her not simply as a wife, not even as an ally in politics, but as something that belonged entirely to him, her thoughts, her gestures, her very voice. Behind the jeweled festivities, the real shape of their marriage was already visible. What the people of Florence celebrated as a grand alliance was, for Eleonora, the beginning of a life where every breath would be measured, every step observed. Her gilded carriage had not carried her to a fairy tale, had delivered her to a cage. The courtiers toasted their union with wine and song. The poets compared their beauty to myth, and the city rejoiced. Yet, in the quiet corners of the Palazzo Pitti, where the music faded and the torches burned low, Eleonora must have felt something. Colder, faint shadow of what her new life with Francesco would mean. The gilded cage at first. Florence embraced its new duchess. Eleonora dazzled the court with her elegance. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of Spanish nobility. Her dark eyes and refined manners earning admiration in salons and chapels alike. To the outside world, her marriage to Francesco seemed to blossom. She bore him 4 children in rapid succession, fulfilling her duty as duchess and strengthening the Medici line. When she appeared at religious festivals, she wore gowns embroidered with gold thread, jewels glittering on her neck and wrists, a living emblem of Florentine prestige. But appearances deceive. Behind the thick walls of the Palazzo Pitti, her life grew smaller and colder with each passing season. Francesco's fascination with Eleonora had sharpened into something darker. It was not love, not even devotion, it was control. He locked her life away, piece by piece, like a collector preserving a precious object. She could not leave the palace without his approval. She was forbidden to speak with men unless a lady-in-waiting hovered close by. Letters from Naples were intercepted, conversations monitored. Even her movements inside the palace were shadowed by attendants loyal to Francesco. What might have been a home became a labyrinth of invisible chains. The irony was cruel. Florence celebrated itself as the beacon of human dignity, the city where philosophers preached liberty, reason, and virtue. But for its duchess, life was anything but free. She had become a porcelain doll in Francesco's private gallery, admired, displayed, but never truly alive. This was not unusual for women of her rank. In Renaissance Italy, noble women were expected to embody chastity, obedience, and silence. Their marriages were rarely unions of affection. They were contracts woven from threads of politics and power. A wife's body was her husband's possession, her honor a reflection of his. To defy him was to invite ruin. A woman's voice could be praised in poetry, but in life it was to be subdued. Francesco embodied this world to its extreme. Obsessed with loyalty, he treated Eleonora not as a partner, but as property. The court whispered that he kept her under a form of house arrest, not from fear of rebellion, but from a deeper paranoia, the belief that any freedom she possessed might threaten his control. Yet Eleonora endured it all with a grace that astonished those who glimpsed her sorrow. She played her part as Duchess, flawlessly attending ceremonies, blessing charities, presenting a serene image to Florence. People saw only a woman cloaked in jewels, smiling beside her husband, the model of a Medici consort. None could have guessed at the loneliness that stretched behind that smile, the desperate quiet that filled her days. But solitude breeds longing, and longing breeds defiance. Deep within Eleonora, a quiet hunger began to stir, hunger for warmth, for recognition, for a life beyond the cold surveillance of her husband's shadow. The gilded cage glittered brightly, but it remained a cage all the same. A dangerous affair by 1573, 13 years into her marriage. Eleonora was 30 years old. She had done everything expected of her, borne children, maintained the grace of a duchess, preserved the illusion of harmony in a palace where harmony had never truly existed. But inside, the silence was suffocating. In a court overflowing with scholars, poets, and artists, she had no voice of her own. She was a woman surrounded by beauty, but denied the freedom to live within it. And then, as if by fate, she met Pietro Bonaventure. Pietro was no nobleman. He was the son of a modest cord maker, newly arrived in Florence from the countryside. But in Renaissance Florence, where poetry was currency and wit could raise a man higher than birth, Pietro had something rare: words that burned with sincerity. He was gentle, curious, unpolished, yet radiant with youthful energy. Francesco's cold eyes measured and possessed. Pietro's gaze invited and understood. Their connection began innocently. A passing conversation in the gardens of the palazzo, a shared reflection on a verse of Petrarch, a quiet remark about the beauty of Florence at dusk. To Eleonora, these moments were not trivial. They were intoxicating. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a duchess, not as a political pawn, but as a woman. Soon, those fragments of stolen conversation blossomed into something far more dangerous. Pietro began writing her verses in a tradition of courtly love, concealing devotion in metaphors of nightingales and hidden rivers. In the Renaissance, poetry was more than art. It was a code, a veil behind which forbidden passions could be expressed. Leonora replied in kind, her words careful, her longing wrapped in allegory. To outsiders, the poems were harmless exercises in style. To them, they were confessions of the soul. They met in secret, aided by the rare moments when Francesco's attention was absorbed by his experiments in alchemy or his affairs with courtiers. Their encounters were fleeting, sometimes no more than an exchange of words in a corridor or a touch of hands in the shadow of the gardens. But each moment was electric, charged with the forbidden. For Eleonora, Pietro was not merely a lover. He was an escape. In his presence, she rediscovered joy, laughter, the warmth of companionship. With him, she imagined a world beyond the suffocating palazzo life, where she could be not the Grand Duchess, but simply Eleonora. In whispered exchanges, they dreamed of escape, of leaving behind the weight of crowns and courts for something humble but free. But Florence was a city of eyes and ears. Spies filled the palaces. Servants traded whispers for coin. And Francesco's paranoia meant that nothing went unseen for long. For 3 years, Eleonora and Pietro kept their secret alive, their affair woven in shadows and silence. At every step carried them closer to discovery. And when Francesco finally learned of it, the fragile sanctuary they had built collapsed in an instant. Betrayal and punishment. The year was 1576, and Francesco's palace had grown darker with suspicion. Whispers had begun to circle, quiet hints of the Duchess's affection for another man. First, Francesco ignored them, for in courts as glittering as Florence, gossip was as common as candle smoke. But one day, truth reached him not as rumor, but as confession, delivered by a woman he trusted, one of Eleonora's own ladies-in-waiting. Whether bribed, threatened, or simply eager to please the Duke, she betrayed her mistress. She revealed everything: the meetings in the garden, the verses passed in secret, the touches stolen when no eyes were meant to see. To Francesco, it was more than betrayal. It was humiliation. In the world of Renaissance nobility, a wife's infidelity was not simply personal, it was political. A duchess's honor was her husband's honor, and her body his possession. For a man like Francesco, obsessed with control and already feared for his severity, Such a betrayal was intolerable. It was an insult that had to be avenged, not only for himself, but as a warning to all Florence. That same night, Pietro Bonaventure was seized. The young man was dragged from the streets, shackled, and taken to one of Francesco's chambers of judgment. What followed was the cruel ritual of Florentine justice. Pietro was interrogated, beaten, and tortured until his body broke and his voice confessed to the affair. Whether his words were voluntary or forced, it did not matter. The sentence had already been decided. Within days, Pietro was executed. His body was thrown into the Arno River, discarded like refuse, denied even the dignity of a grave. The current carried him away, his life extinguished not only to erase his presence, but to send a message. Those who touched what belonged to Francesco would be erased from memory itself. But Francesco's vengeance did not stop with Pietro. His rage burned deeper, focused now on Eleonora. For him, it was not enough to kill her lover. She too must be punished. That simply ended, but silenced in a manner that would echo through Florence like a warning bell. And so, he devised a deception. He summoned Eleonora to the Villa Medici di Cafaggiolo, a secluded estate in the Tuscan hills. He spoke of reconciliation, of retreat, of beginning anew. He told her it was a chance to repair the marriage, to find peace away from the noise of Florence. Eleonora believed him. Perhaps she wanted to believe, clinging to some last hope that the years of coldness might give way to tenderness. She entered the villa with trust, unaware that she had walked into her final stage. The halls of Cafaggiolo were strangely quiet that night. Few servants remained, only those most loyal to Francesco. A banquet was laid, and Francesco played his part with chilling ease. He smiled, spoke of family, of the future, of their children. For a moment, Eleonora might have thought the nightmare was ending. Behind every word, behind every glass of wine poured, another truth waited in silence. For Francesco had not brought her there to reconcile. He had brought her to deliver judgment. The night of terror at the Villa Medici di Cafaggiolo. The July evening was warm, the air heavy with the scent of cypress and wild rosemary from the surrounding hills. The banquet Francesco staged for his wife was meant to disarm her. Silver, goblets of wine, roasted meats, candied fruits glistening in the lamplight. He played the role of a reconciled husband with unsettling calm, speaking of family, of the children they had raised, of the future they might still share. Eleonora, weary after years of coldness and suspicion, allowed herself to hope. Perhaps this was a turning point. Perhaps Francesco, in the solitude of this villa, had rediscovered affection. But as the meal ended and they withdrew to their chamber, the masks slipped. Francesco produced a bundle of letters, Pietro's letters, poems written in secrecy, promises whispered in ink, words of longing that had once made her heart tremble. He forced her to read them aloud, each line an indictment, each word a blade. Servants stood in the shadows, silent, waiting. Then came the order. 2 men seized her, pressing her against the carved bed frame. She cried out, but the chamber doors were locked, and no one beyond those walls would dare intervene. Francesco, calm and deliberate, revealed the punishment he had prepared. The official records tell us little. They state only that Eleonora died that night of a sudden illness, a fever that struck without warning. But Florence has never believed it. A spirit legend, passed from servant to servant, from generation to generation, paints a far more horrific picture. They say Francesco called for professional torturous men who specialized in pain, who knew how to turn punishment into theater. Together, they devised a sentence that was both physical and symbolic. If Eleonora had used her mouth to betray him with words of love, with kisses meant for another, then it would be her mouth that paid the ultimate price. The tale says he took a silk thread, the very fabric of refinement and elegance, and with his own hands sewed her lips shut, stitch by stitch, elegant and deliberate, silken beauty twisted into an instrument of cruelty. Some claimed she remained conscious through it all, her muffled cries filling the chamber until even the servants turned pale with horror. Whether the story is fact or legend, its symbolism is undeniable. To sew shut her lips was to silence her utterly, to erase her voice from the world. It was not simply murder, it was domination, the brutal reduction of a woman into an object stripped of speech, stripped of will. As dawn crept across the Tuscan hills, Eleanor's body finally gave in. Perhaps she suffocated in her terror. Perhaps fever truly overtook her when morning came. She was dead. Francesco summoned physicians from Florence, performing grief as if on a stage. He told them his wife had fallen ill in the night, that her death had been sudden and tragic. The doctors, whether deceived or complicit, signed the documents, the cause of death, fever, and with ink upon parchment. The horror of that night was buried beneath official ceremony, but Florence was not so easily deceived. Servants whispered of muffled cries, of strange marks around her mouth hastily concealed with powder before the coffin was opened. And though the court tried to silence the rumors, the city was already alive with them. Something unspeakable had happened in the villa that night, and no decree could erase it. A silenced voice, the official mourning for Eleonora, was swift and grand, as befitted a Medici duchess. Black draperies veiled the windows of the Palazzo Pitti. Church bells tolled in heavy rhythm, and solemn masses were sung in her memory. Francesco, dressed in black velvet, walked with a face of carved stone, presenting to the world the image of a grieving husband struck by cruel fate. But Florence was not fooled. The whispers spread faster than any decree could contain. Merchants in the piazzas murmured that the duchess had not died of fever, but of betrayal. Servants who had been at Carfagelo spoke in hushed tones of cries in the night, of locked chambers, of the duke's rage. Some claimed they had seen the marks themselves, fine scars traced at the corners of her mouth, hastily concealed with powders before her coffin was closed. The people of Florence, ever fascinated by scandal, carried the tale through the city. Streets, in taverns, and workshops, they retold it, with each retelling darker, more vivid, that Francesco had ordered her lips sewn shut as punishment for adultery, that her death was not sudden, but slow and deliberate. The story became more than gossip. It became symbol for Renaissance Florence, a city that prized beauty, eloquence, and the power of the spoken word. The image of a woman's lips sewn shut was a horror too poignant to ignore. It was the silencing of a voice, the destruction of beauty, the ultimate act of control. Captured the truth of Eleonora's life, gilded, admired, yet silenced until the very end. Whether it was fact or legend no longer mattered. The story had become myth, and myth often reveals a deeper truth than record books dare admit. Francesco, for all his efforts, could not erase that myth. He ruled Florence with growing severity, burying himself in alchemy, rare stones, and experiments of fire and poison. He remarried, taking Bianca Capello, his Venetian mistress, as his new wife. Yet Eleonora's ghost lingered. She haunted not the halls of the palazzo, but the imagination of the people, too many Florentines. She became a symbol of the dangers faced by women bound in marriages of power. She was the duchess who embodied grace, who endured silence, who reached for love and paid with her life. Her lips, whether truly sewn shut or not, remained forever sealed in memory, reminder of how beauty and voice could be destroyed by possession and fear. And so the legend survived, passed through the centuries, whispered in the same city that once celebrated her as a jewel of Spain and Florence alike. The chronicles may list her death as fever. But Florence remembers differently. Florence remembers the night her voice was taken.